in the far reaches of the Hellion expanse, far away from the busy and well-mapped territories of the galaxy, there existed a civilization that most outsiders considered fragile, peaceful, and almost invisible. The Arvine had lived for centuries on a series of lush, green planets scattered across a quiet star cluster. Their worlds were not known for advanced weaponry or military might, nor did they desire it. Instead, their society focused on harmony, agriculture, and knowledge. The Arvini were deeply connected to their environment, building cities that blended seamlessly with natural landscapes. Towering trees grew through transparent domes, rivers ran under crystalline bridges, and fields of golden grain swayed under artificial skies that simulated perfect weather. Their cities were quiet, serene, and carefully designed to avoid waste, conflict, or harm to anyone living nearby. Despite their peaceful nature, the Arvini were not naive. Over generations, they had learned to recognize the dangers of the galaxy. They were aware that beyond the safety of their systems lurked empires and factions that saw the Hellion expanse not as a place for peaceful life, but as territory to be conquered or resources to be exploited. While the Arvine had managed to avoid major conflicts, skirmishes along the fringes of their space were common. They maintained a small defensive fleet, not for domination but purely for deterrence, enough to protect key population centers and warning satellites. Even then, they knew that their ships would not be able to hold back a determined enemy for long. Their strategy relied on diplomacy, sending envoys to form alliances, and making agreements with stronger civilizations that had the resources and power to intervene if a crisis arose. This peaceful routine, however, was shattered when the Krell Dominion suddenly appeared. The Krell were a warlike species, known across several sectors for their aggressive expansion and ruthless tactics. Unlike the Arvine, the Krell thrived on conflict. Their ships were fast, well-armed, and equipped with weapons capable of leveling entire cities. Colonies that resisted Krell domination were usually destroyed or forcibly integrated into their empire. They did not negotiate, they conquered. When a Krell scouting fleet discovered the outer colonies of the Arvine, they immediately saw an opportunity. The Arvini had resources, minerals, fertile planets, and energy nodes that could benefit the Dominion's war machine. The Krell Dominion decided that instead of wasting time in diplomacy, they would strike first. Word of the approaching threat spread quickly through Arvini networks. At first, disbelief lingered. The Arvini could not comprehend that a species would come to their worlds not to trade or learn, but simply to take by force. They began mobilizing their defensive fleets. Although even fully prepared, their forces were no match for the Krell armada. The elders and leaders of Arvini society convened in emergency councils, discussing possible strategies. Panic and fear began to ripple through the population. Families in outer colonies were evacuated to safer areas when possible, while the central planets tried to reinforce defensive perimeters. But the truth was clear. Without external help, the Arvini faced near-certain destruction. Recognizing the limits of their own capabilities, the Arvine activated the oldest contingency they had, sending distress signals to the nearest major alliances, specifically the Unity Coalition. The Unity Coalition was a federation of multiple civilizations committed to diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and collective defense. Historically, the Arvini had worked with the coalition in trade and research agreements, relying on their reputation for justice and intervention in times of need. The Arvini transmitted a detailed message, highlighting the nature of the Krell threat, the size of the invasion fleet, and the immediate danger to civilian populations. They emphasized that their defense was failing and that every minute counted. They broadcasted the signal across multiple communication bands, hoping that at least one would be received promptly. The Arvine, despite their fear, still held hope. Their society was built on trust and interstellar alliances, and they had always believed that their appeals for help would be answered. When the distress signals were sent, communities held their collective breath, awaiting confirmation that aid was on the way. Children, unaware of the scale of the threat, watched with wide eyes as adults hurried to complete evacuations and reinforce weak defenses. Scholars and engineers worked around the clock to prepare evacuation vessels, shield reinforcements, and emergency energy supplies. The atmosphere was tense but disciplined. Every individual knew their role, from organizing civilians to preparing communication arrays for updates. While the Arvini waited, they began to notice unusual readings on their sensors. Massive energy fluctuations, not from Krell ships, began appearing near the borders of their system. Initially, the Arvine speculated that the coalition ships were finally arriving, but the patterns were unlike anything in the historical records. The energy signatures were erratic yet extremely powerful, moving at speeds that no coalition vessel had been known to achieve. The Arvini scientists could not immediately identify the source. Some speculated that the Krell were deploying secret superweapons, while others feared unknown cosmic phenomena. Anxiety and confusion spread, but there was also a glimmer of curiosity. Whatever was coming was clearly not ordinary, and it was approaching with extraordinary speed. Meanwhile, far across human space, beyond the borders of known territories and even beyond the attention of most galactic powers, a specialized fleet received the same distress call. This was the Deathworlder fleet, a group of human warriors with a fearsome reputation. Stories of their capabilities had circulated in whispers for decades. The Deathworlders were humans who had been trained to survive in the most hostile environments imaginable, from planets with corrosive atmospheres to systems dominated by massive gravity storms. Their military doctrine was unlike any other: precision, discipline, and a willingness to take risks that others deemed suicidal. Their fleet consisted of ships designed for survival, rapid strike, and maximum damage in minimal time. Across the galaxy, even the most formidable powers gave them a wide berth, for encounters rarely ended without decisive results. The Deathworlder fleet did not usually respond to requests for aid, unless a situation met their strict criteria. Yet, when the distress signal from the Arvini arrived, it triggered immediate attention. The message was clear, urgent, and carried the unmistakable signature of a species in danger. Human analysts, looking at the data, recognized not only the imminent threat from the Krell Dominion but also the vulnerability of the Arvine civilization. For the Deathworlders, this was not merely a call for help, it was a challenge to act where others could not, while the Arvini hoped for a gentle intervention. The Deathworlders interpreted the call as a mandate to intervene decisively, without hesitation. That, as the Arvini continued preparations, the fleet of the Krell Dominion moved closer. Their warships cut through space with terrifying efficiency, and scouts reported that they had identified key Arvini command centers and civilian hubs. Panic escalated in the colonies, and defensive systems began to falter under the pressure of Krell probing attacks. The Arvini leaders realized that the situation was far more critical than they had anticipated. Their last hope lay not in their defenses, which were already insufficient, but in the arrival of external forces that could arrive in time to prevent total annihilation. They prayed that the coalition would answer their call. But what arrived was something else entirely. Long-range sensors first detected flashes of FTL energy appearing at the edge of the system, followed by unmistakable, enormous signatures. The ships were unlike any seen before: black, angular, heavily armored, and radiating a dangerous aura. The Arvine could not believe what they were witnessing. Fear and awe gripped the population. Whispers spread among scientists and engineers. The stories were true. They exist. The Deathworlders have arrived. Families huddled together in shelters, unsure whether the new arrivals would save them or bring even greater danger. That Arvine had prepared for one thing: diplomats, mediators, or at most, coalition soldiers. They had never imagined the most feared warriors of human space would answer their distress call. The Arvine could see the first ships moving into position, scanning the Krell fleet, and the energy readings spiked with unusual intensity. Even from orbit, the difference was evident. The Deathworlder ships exuded confidence, control, and calculated power, unlike the Krell Dominion, whose approach was chaotic and aggressive. The Deathworlders moved with methodical precision, almost as if the galaxy itself obeyed their command. The Arvine understood one thing clearly: whoever these humans were, they were here for one purpose: to respond to the call for help, no matter what it took. In that tense moment, the Arvini realized the true scope of the galaxy. They had always assumed their survival depended on alliances and negotiations. Now they understood that there were powers in the universe beyond diplomacy, forces whose mere presence could alter the balance of life and death. Their understanding of hope changed in an instant. The Arvini waited, hearts racing. As the approaching fleet confirmed the ancient legends, help had arrived, but in a form far more powerful, dangerous, and decisive than anything they could have imagined. Even as the first ships began to take positions around the outer colonies, the Arvini braced themselves. They did not yet know how the Deathworlders would act, or what the consequences might be. All they knew was that the peaceful galaxy they had lived in for centuries was about to be forever changed, and the day that began as a plea for aid had now become the day the most feared protectors in the universe arrived to answer their call. As the days passed after the first warnings of the Krell Dominion's approach, the Arvine began to feel the real weight of the threat pressing upon them. The initial panic and disbelief had transformed into a slow-burning fear, the kind that gnawed at the edges of every decision and action. The Arvini leadership quickly realized that hope alone would not be enough to save their people. They had already sent distress signals to the Unity Coalition, their trusted allies across the galaxy, but the response had been delayed. Signals that once traveled in minutes now seemed sluggish, almost taunting in their absence. In the meantime, the Krell Dominion's invasion fleet grew closer, their scouts scouring the outer colonies and reporting back with chilling efficiency. The Arvini outer colonies, scattered across minor planets and asteroid habitats, were the first to feel the Krell presence. Small outposts were overwhelmed by swift assaults, communication arrays destroyed, and resource depots stripped bare. Families who had lived in relative safety for generations suddenly found themselves in chaos. Evacuation protocols were enacted, but they could not reach everyone in time. Children clung to their parents. Elders shuffled through corridors, and entire communities were forced to flee in cramped transport vessels, leaving behind homes, possessions, and years of history. The Arvine were unaccustomed to such rapid violence, and their society, built on harmony and order, struggled to maintain cohesion amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, the Krell Dominion moved with ruthless precision. Their ships were more than just vessels. They were mobile fortresses bristling with weaponry, missiles capable of obliterating entire districts, energy cannons that could cut through planetary defenses, and advanced electronic warfare systems allowed them to disable Arvini communications with frightening speed. The Arvini quickly realized that their own defense fleet, though prepared and trained, was hopelessly outmatched. Their ships were slower, lighter, and armed with weapons designed for deterrence, not full-scale battle. Every engagement with the Krell ended with significant losses, leaving the Arvane increasingly desperate in response. The Arvane leaders called an emergency session of the High Council. Scholars, military advisors, and community leaders gathered in the central domed city, their faces etched with worry. The discussions were intense. Some argued for immediate evacuation of as many colonies as possible, even if it meant abandoning resources and infrastructure. Others insisted that abandoning the colonies without resistance would invite complete domination by the Krell and destroy their cultural identity. A few more radical voices suggested forming alliances with other nearby species, even if it meant negotiating with groups that were historically neutral or hostile to the IV. Every option had risks. Every plan seemed inadequate in the face of the approaching fleet. Amidst the chaos, scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to upgrade what defenses they could. Shield generators were reinforced, energy grids rerouted, and decoy systems activated to confuse Krell targeting. Every moment was precious. Yet, despite their efforts, it became painfully clear that without external assistance, the Arvini were fighting a losing battle. Their small fleet could only delay the inevitable for so long. Panic began to spread among the civilian population, with many losing faith that any help would arrive in time, just as despair threatened to overwhelm them. The unusual energy signatures detected days before began to grow stronger. The readings indicated that something massive was entering their system at incredible speed, far faster than anything the Arvine had ever seen. Scientists monitored the data closely, running simulations and trying to interpret the unfamiliar patterns. Many feared that the Krell had unleashed a new type of weapon or that an unknown cosmic phenomenon was approaching. But slowly a tentative hope emerged. Whatever was coming, it was not aligned with the Krell Dominion. The energy signatures did not match the destructive patterns of Krell technology. Instead, they suggested movement, intelligence, and purpose beyond the conventional dot. As the Krell advanced, the Arvine continued their evacuation and defensive measures, hoping that these unidentified ships might offer aid. Yet even as hope returned, fear persisted. The Deathworlder fleet had a terrifying reputation across the galaxy. Stories told of human warriors who could survive any environment, fight in impossible conditions, and destroy enemies thought invincible. Too many, they were legends, almost mythical figures that existed more in whispers than reality. The Arvine had never interacted with humans before, and they had no way to predict how the Deathworlders would act. Would they intervene to save civilians, or would they see the conflict as an opportunity to impose their own order? Meanwhile, the Krell Dominion grew more aggressive. They realized that their initial assaults were not yielding the swift victory they had expected. The Arvine, though under-equipped, were clever and resourceful, using the terrain of their planets, the layout of cities, and clever tactics to slow the Krell advance. Small fleets would appear unexpectedly, strike at vulnerable points in the Krell formation, and vanish before retaliation. The Krell, accustomed to easy conquests, found themselves frustrated by a seemingly primitive civilization that could still resist, even if only temporarily. Every skirmish added tension, as Krell commanders demanded faster results and harsher measures in the cities that remained intact. Fear mingled with determination. Civilians took up roles they had never imagined for themselves, helping construct defenses, transporting supplies, and guiding evacuees. Teachers led children through underground tunnels to shelters. Farmers carried essential equipment to safer locations, and engineers patched failing systems under pressure. The sense of urgency and danger created a strange unity among the Arvini, as if the threat itself had forced them to become stronger, faster, and more resilient. Their society, normally cautious and measured, adapted rapidly, driven by the instinct to survive. Every day, the Arvine received reports of Krell attacks, each one more devastating than the last. Outer colonies were overrun, supply lines cut, and key infrastructure destroyed. The Arvini fleet was spread thin, attempting to defend multiple locations simultaneously. In some sectors, local defenders made valiant stands, buying time for civilians to escape. In others, entire communities were lost almost instantly, leaving survivors to flee into the void of space, uncertain of where they could find safety. Each loss weighed heavily on the Arvini leadership, who struggled with the moral burden of choosing which colonies to defend and which to sacrifice. Amidst all this chaos, a faint signal began to appear in their sensors. Unlike the Krell attacks, which were aggressive and destructive, this signal was organized, purposeful, and unmistakably powerful. That Arvin could detect the formation of massive ships, moving with precision, scanning the Krell fleet, and preparing to intervene. The readings were impossible to ignore. Whatever was coming could tip the balance of the battle entirely. Fear returned, mixed with awe. For the first time in days, The Arvine allowed themselves to imagine that they might survive this crisis. As the unidentified fleet drew closer, the Arvine noticed patterns in its movement. The ships did not engage the Krell immediately. Instead, they positioned themselves strategically, observing, analyzing, and preparing for maximum efficiency. This methodical approach was unlike anything the Arvine had ever encountered. It became clear that these were not ordinary allies or diplomats. These were warriors of immense capability. The fear of being overwhelmed by a powerful force was real, but the hope that this force might be their salvation was stronger in the colonies and cities still standing. Preparations for the impending arrival reached a fever pitch. Civilians were moved to shelters, communication lines secured, and emergency supplies stockpiled. Soldiers trained for decades now watched in awe and anxiety as the massive ships appeared on the horizon, their presence sending ripples of fear through the Krell ranks. Children, who had been kept unaware of the full danger until now, gazed at the skies in wonder and terror. Parents explained that these were their saviors, mysterious and powerful beings whose arrival would decide the fate of their worlds. The Arvine leadership, while grateful, also felt the weight of uncertainty. They had sent their pleas for help, hoping for diplomatic or conventional military assistance, but the scale and nature of the approaching fleet was beyond anything they could have anticipated. Would the Deathworlders fight only the Krell, or would they impose their own judgment? Could the Arvine survive intact, or would their civilization be forever changed by the presence of these formidable humans? Despite these questions, one truth became undeniable. The battle for their survival was about to enter a new phase, one in which the rules they had relied upon no longer applied. As the fleet moved closer, the Arvine watched the first glimpses of human engineering and technology. The ships were immense, angular, and heavily armored, radiating power in every sensor reading. Their energy signatures dwarfed anything the Arvine had ever seen, and their weapon systems were capable of overwhelming the Krell fleet in ways that seemed almost magical. That Arvine realized that, for the first time, the impossible might become possible. They might survive the Krell dominion not because of their own strength, but because of the arrival of beings who operated on a level beyond comprehension. In the outer colonies, where fear and desperation were highest, the news spread rapidly. Whispers of the Deathworlders' legendary abilities ignited both terror and hope. Survivors speculated about the motives of these humans. Would they act with compassion, as the Arvine had hoped, or would they act according to their own code, indifferent to the nuances of Arvine society? These questions lingered, unanswered, as everyone braced for the inevitable confrontation between the Krell dominion and the approaching fleet. Even as the tension mounted, the Arvine continued their efforts to survive. Defensive networks were reinforced, evacuation routes finalized, and civilians guided to safety. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair damaged ships and systems, while scouts monitored Krell movements with increasing urgency. Every day brought new losses and new challenges, but the knowledge that the Deathworlder fleet was approaching gave the population a fragile sense of hope. It was a hope unlike any they had known, one that combined fear and anticipation in equal measure. That as the first ships of the Deathworlder fleet began to make their presence unmistakable, the Arvine realized that the balance of power in the Hellion expanse was about to shift. The Krell dominion, confident in their previous victories and expecting only conventional resistance, would soon face a force unlike anything they had ever encountered. And the Arvine, caught between the past devastation and the uncertain arrival of these legendary humans, waited with bated breath for the events that would determine whether their civilization would endure or be forever lost. The coming confrontation promised not just survival, but a profound transformation of the Arvine's understanding of the galaxy. They had expected aid in the form of familiar allies, diplomats, or soldiers. Instead, the universe had sent a force both terrifying and awe-inspiring, whose presence alone had already begun to change the trajectory of the conflict. The Arvine could do nothing but prepare, watch, and hope that these extraordinary beings would act in their favor. The fate of their worlds, their culture, and their people hung in the balance as the days edged closer to the decisive moment of confrontation. The Hellion expanse had never been more tense. Days of uncertainty and fear had left the Arvine population on edge, and now the moment that everyone had been waiting for or dreading was finally arriving. From orbit, the first glimpses of the Deathworlder fleet became undeniable. Immense black armored ships cut through space like predators, radiating power and authority. Their formation was precise, almost surgical, moving in perfect synchronization. Every vessel seemed to have a purpose, every maneuver calculated to dominate the battlefield even before a single shot was fired. The Arvine, watching from their observation stations and shelters, felt a mixture of awe and terror. They had known humans existed in legend, but nothing in their history could prepare them for the scale and precision of what they were seeing. The Krell dominion, on the other hand, was caught completely off guard. Having grown accustomed to easy victories against less advanced civilizations, their scouts had assumed that the Arvine would be eliminated before any meaningful aid could arrive. Their initial arrogance made them underestimate the power approaching their territory. The first sensors picked up the Deathworlder ships just as they entered the system, and Krell commanders were forced to halt their assault temporarily. Confusion rippled through the ranks. Orders were given, rescinded, and adjusted in frantic cycles. They had faced powerful enemies before, but nothing like this. The fleet's presence alone radiated an aura of intimidation so strong that even the most battle-hardened Krell officers hesitated. For the Arvine, the sight of the Deathworlder fleet arriving was both reassuring and alarming. They had feared the Krell invasion might destroy everything they had built, and now an unknown power had entered the system. The Deathworlders did not send diplomatic messages or negotiate. They did not offer reassurances. Instead, their ships moved with deliberate, precise, and terrifying intent. The Arvine could only watch as the humans positioned themselves strategically around the Krell forces, forming a perimeter that was almost impossible to penetrate. The message was clear. They were here to deal with the threat, and they intended to do it decisively. As the Krell resumed their advance, they discovered the magnitude of their miscalculation. The Deathworlder ships did not just wait passively, they began to act. Strike groups detached from the main fleet and moved at astonishing speed toward the Krell vanguard. These were not normal attacks. Each maneuver seemed to anticipate the Krell's responses before they even occurred. Energy beams sliced through the void, disabling enemy ships without causing uncontrolled explosions. Advanced targeting systems allowed human crews to disable weapons and engines with deadly accuracy. Every strike was efficient, surgical, and overwhelming. The Krell Dominion, despite their numbers and experience, struggled to keep up. Chaos spread among their ranks as ships were disabled and formations broken apart with frightening speed. On the ground, the Arvine could feel the difference almost immediately. The Krell's orbital bombardments and missile strikes slowed, then ceased entirely. Sensors picked up the systematic dismantling of enemy vessels, and the surviving Krell forces began retreating in disarray. Panic replaced their initial confidence. For the first time in the invasion, the Arvine realized that the tide might be turning not through their own power, but because of these mysterious human warriors. Children and civilians peered out from shelters, staring at the skies as massive explosions illuminated the void, each one a sign of the Deathworlder's intervention. Fear mixed with awe. The beings they had once feared as possible destroyers were now proving to be their saviors. The Krell commanders tried to regroup, issuing orders to concentrate fire on what they assumed were vulnerable sections of the Deathworlder fleet. But their efforts were futile. Human tactics relied on unpredictability combined with overwhelming precision. Even when the Krell managed to inflict minor damage, the Deathworlders responded instantly, neutralizing threats before they could escalate. Their speed, coordination, and foresight were beyond anything the Krell had encountered. In minutes, what had been a massive invasion force became scattered and disorganized, a shadow of its former threat. Meanwhile, the Arvine leadership faced a mixture of relief and amazement. From their vantage points, they could see the tactical genius of the Deathworlders in action. The humans were not indiscriminate. They targeted only the Krell forces, leaving civilian structures untouched. Every strike seemed to be calculated to protect lives while maximizing the effectiveness of the fleet. That Arvine could barely comprehend how one group could change the outcome of a war in such a short time. Scholars and strategists analyzed the human movements in awe, realizing that the technology and tactics displayed were far beyond anything the Arvine had encountered before. On the surface, citizens began to emerge cautiously from shelters. The sounds of destruction and energy discharges reverberated through the atmosphere. Yet the Arvine sensed that the danger was no longer immediate. Parents held their children, whispering reassurances that had previously felt hollow. Soldiers, exhausted from days of fighting, felt a renewed sense of purpose. They continued to assist in evacuations and maintain local defenses. But now, with the knowledge that a force far more capable than themselves had taken command of the battle, the Krell, however, were not ready to concede. They attempted desperate maneuvers, splitting their fleets and targeting weak points. They deployed heavy ion cannons, missile swarms, and electronic countermeasures to disrupt the human systems. Yet each attempt failed. The Deathworlders adapted instantly, countering the Krell tactics in real time with solutions that were both elegant and terrifyingly effective. The Krell could not understand how their attacks, which would normally have overwhelmed any other civilization, were being nullified. Confusion and fear escalated among their forces. In the midst of the chaos, the Arvine observed something extraordinary. The Deathworlder fleet did not simply annihilate the enemy. It contained the conflict with surgical control. Instead of creating indiscriminate destruction, the humans focused on neutralizing the threat with minimal collateral damage. Entire Krell squadrons were disabled without destroying nearby colonies. Energy shields were reinforced on civilian areas, and evacuation paths remained clear. The Arvine realized that these were not just warriors, they were protectors in a way the galaxy had never seen before. Their actions were brutal to the enemy, precise in execution, and merciful to the innocent. As the battle escalated further, ground forces and orbital defense stations coordinated with the fleet as much as they could. The Krell Dominion, sensing that they were being overwhelmed, launched one final desperate assault on the Arvine capital. Missiles streaked through the void, and beams of destructive energy lit up the skies. Citizens feared the worst. Yet the Deathworlders anticipated this critical moment. Strike teams detached from the main fleet, moving faster than any sensor could fully track. They intercepted the Krell assault, dismantling their weapons, disabling engines, and neutralizing threats with terrifying speed. What would have been a catastrophic strike against the Arvine was turned into a controlled engagement. Civilians watched from shelters as the enemy's forces were reduced almost instantly, realizing that the humans were not just powerful, they were unstoppable in their precision. The Arvini leadership began to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. The Deathworlders were not there to negotiate or wait for instructions. They were taking full command of the situation. Their intervention had already saved countless lives and changed the balance of power in the system. Even as Krell forces attempted to regroup, the Deathworlders anticipated every move, countering each attempt with efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. Communication networks picked up only a single terse broadcast from the fleet: "Stand down. You attacked civilians. Now you answer to us." The message was simple, chilling, and authoritative. No further explanation was given. It was understood that any disobedience would be met with immediate and decisive action. At that moment, the critical turning point of the battle had arrived. The Krell Dominion, once confident in their conquest, was now in full retreat. Their advanced ships, which had terrorized countless civilizations, were systematically dismantled or forced to flee. The Arvine, witnessing the scene from orbit, experienced a mixture of fear, gratitude, and awe. But humans, whose existence had been largely myth until now, had entered their conflict and fundamentally altered the outcome. They had arrived when the Arvini were on the brink of despair, and through sheer skill, planning, and determination, they had saved the civilization from near annihilation. Ground teams of the Deathworlders began to deploy in key areas, moving to secure cities, rescue civilians, and prevent further Krell incursions. Arvini soldiers coordinated cautiously, amazed at the humans' ability to operate in environments they had only dreamed of navigating. Every human action was efficient, purposeful, and highly controlled. They neutralized threats, provided medical assistance, and repaired essential infrastructure damaged by the Krell assault. The Arvini quickly realized that survival in this battle was no longer dependent on their own defenses, but on the incredible capabilities of these humans who had arrived seemingly out of nowhere. As the battle reached its climax, the Arvini and surviving Krell forces both had to adapt. The Krell, humbled and terrified by the sudden appearance of the Deathworlder fleet, abandoned aggressive maneuvers and fled in disarray. The Arvini, still struggling with shock and awe, worked alongside the human teams to stabilize critical areas, evacuate the injured, and assess damages. The once imminent threat of annihilation was now being reversed, and the Arvine began to understand that their civilization might not just survive but thrive in the aftermath of this encounter. Even as the battle wound down, the critical moment left an indelible impression on the Arvine. They had expected the arrival of diplomats, soldiers, or traditional allies, but what appeared was something far beyond their imagination. A fleet of warriors who could protect life while destroying their enemies with unmatched precision. The Arvini realized that the galaxy was far larger, more complex, and more dangerous than they had ever understood. And yet, within that dangerous universe, they had discovered a new hope, one tied to the presence of these extraordinary humans who had intervened decisively at the most critical moment. The skies above Arvini cities were filled with both devastation and relief. Fires that had once consumed villages were beginning to die down. Evacuated civilians could finally breathe without immediate fear, and the Krell, broken and scattered, could no longer pose an immediate threat. The Arvini understood that the intervention had not just saved their people, but had redefined their understanding of survival and protection. The critical moment of the battle had passed, but its consequences would echo for generations. They had learned the full scope of human power, the terrifying efficiency of the Deathworlders, and the reality that the galaxy's legends were not always exaggerated. In the aftermath of the battle, even as immediate repairs and evacuations continued, the Arvini took time to reflect on what had occurred. The Deathworlders had not just arrived, they had changed the course of history in the Hellion expanse. The civilization had survived the brink of annihilation, not through their own might, but through the intervention of beings whose skills, discipline, and power were almost unimaginable. Every Arvine, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, would carry the memory of this day forever. The day when the most feared warriors in the galaxy arrived at the critical moment and turned despair into salvation. The battle that had seemed impossible to survive for the Arvine was finally turning in their favor. The Deathworlder fleet, having entered the system with unmatched precision, now focused on finishing the task that had begun so suddenly and decisively. What had been days of terror and chaos was now transforming into a carefully executed operation of rescue, recovery, and reclamation. The Krell Dominion, once confident in their overwhelming superiority, had been thoroughly disrupted and broken. Their ships either disabled, fleeing, or destroyed, they no longer posed an immediate threat. The Arvini could hardly believe their eyes. Their cities, villages, and far-flung colonies had been moments away from annihilation. And yet now, through the intervention of these mysterious humans, survival seemed possible. The Deathworlders did not linger or celebrate victory. Their approach was methodical and disciplined, as if the destruction and chaos around them were simply obstacles to be removed in the most efficient way possible. Strike teams began to move toward the planets themselves, deploying from orbit to secure key locations, rescue civilians, and neutralize lingering threats. Massive shuttles descended with incredible speed and accuracy, landing near areas most in danger. Ground teams, trained for environments even more hostile than the Hellion expanse, moved swiftly through cities and towns. They cleared debris, secured damaged structures, and established temporary command posts for coordinating relief. Every action was precise, focused, and designed to save lives. Civilians watched with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and relief as these human teams moved through their homes and neighborhoods. Many Arvini had heard stories of human warriors, but seeing them in action was overwhelming. They were larger, stronger, and faster than the Arvini had imagined. Their armor was sleek, dark, and impenetrable, and their weapons radiated power without the uncontrolled destruction the Krell had unleashed. Even in the middle of what had been war-torn streets, the humans moved with grace and efficiency. They carried injured civilians with ease, guided people to safe zones, and neutralized remaining pockets of Krell resistance. The Arvini military, previously scattered and overwhelmed, found themselves working alongside these human forces for the first time. Soldiers who had been exhausted and demoralized regained their courage, seeing the humans' competence and discipline. Coordination improved almost instantly. The Deathworlders did not demand unnecessary orders or explanations. They acted, and the Arvini followed where appropriate. The contrast between the Arvini's defensive measures and the humans' decisive interventions was stark. While the Arvini had been cautious and reactive, the humans were proactive, anticipating threats, and acting before danger could fully materialize. The Krell scattered. Some attempted last-minute attacks, hoping to inflict damage before retreating. These efforts were met with instantaneous and overwhelming force. In every engagement, the humans neutralized the threat without causing unnecessary collateral damage. Entire Krell squadrons were disabled with surgical precision, allowing civilians to remain safe in nearby areas. The Arvini could barely comprehend the efficiency and restraint of these warriors. They were destroying enemies with unmatched skill, yet deliberately avoiding harming anyone innocent. For the first time in days, the Arvini felt a sense of safety returning to their world. Meanwhile, rescue operations intensified. The Deathworlder ground teams moved through cities, towns, and colonies, locating civilians trapped under debris or hiding in shelters. Hospitals and medical facilities that had been destroyed or overwhelmed by the Krell assault were quickly stabilized. Humans with specialized medical training attended to the injured, using advanced field equipment that the Arvini had never seen before. People who had suffered injuries that would have been fatal only hours earlier were now being treated and stabilized. Every recovery was executed with speed, care, and efficiency, reinforcing the Arvini's growing trust in these unknown warriors. Supply lines, previously disrupted by Krell attacks, were re-established. The Deathworlders deployed automated drones and transport ships to deliver essential resources, food, water, energy, and medical supplies. They repaired damaged energy grids and stabilized shield generators, ensuring that the cities could function safely while rebuilding efforts began. Engineers worked alongside Arvini specialists, learning quickly and implementing human strategies for rapid recovery. Even civilians without technical knowledge were given guidance, allowing communities to participate actively in rebuilding their lives. This combination of precision, technology, and leadership made the process of recovery astonishingly fast. Communication networks, which had been targeted and partially destroyed by the Krell, were re-established under the Deathworlder's supervision. This allowed the Arvini leadership to coordinate evacuations more effectively, locate survivors, and maintain situational awareness across multiple colonies. Messages between planets flowed with unprecedented speed and reliability, providing critical updates on both ongoing threats and successful rescues. The Arvini quickly realized that their survival, previously uncertain, was now being managed with strategic foresight. Every move of the Deathworlders seemed deliberate, efficient, and designed to stabilize their civilization while eliminating danger. As the immediate Krell threat diminished, the Deathworlders turned their attention to neutralizing remaining hazards. Mines, traps, and destabilized structures were removed from key population centers. Areas that had been under direct assault were inspected, reinforced, and secured. Civilians who had been displaced were returned to safe homes or temporary shelters, depending on the level of damage. Children who had been terrified by the sounds of battle were guided back into routines, with humans assisting in the process. Teachers, parents, and community leaders worked alongside the Deathworlders to restore a sense of normalcy, all under the careful supervision and protection of these powerful humans. Even as the rescue operations continued, the Arvini were forced to reflect on the scale of what had occurred. Their civilization had been on the brink of annihilation, yet through the decisive intervention of the Deathworlders they had survived. The Krell Dominion had been decisively defeated, not through diplomacy, negotiation, or luck, but through the actions of beings whose skill and precision were beyond anything the Arvini had known. they began to realize that these humans had saved not only lives but also the cultural, technological, and social structures of their worlds. The Arvini had been spared complete devastation, and their future was now being preserved in ways they could scarcely comprehend. Throughout this process, the Arvini noticed the humans' remarkable combination of discipline and restraint. They did not overextend their power, nor did they act recklessly. They neutralized threats with exacting efficiency, but never caused unnecessary damage to civilians or infrastructure. Their actions were deliberate, controlled, and effective. The Arvini were witnessing something unprecedented, a force capable of extreme destruction, yet exercising restraint to protect the innocent. The contrast between the Krell, whose attacks were indiscriminate and brutal, and the Deathworlders, whose strikes were calculated and precise, could not have been clearer. As days passed, the Krell Dominion's scattered forces were either captured or forced to flee entirely from the system. The immediate threat to the Arvini was neutralized. What had seemed like a hopeless situation a week earlier was now fully under control. Citizens returned to their homes where possible. Repairs were underway, and a sense of cautious optimism began to replace the pervasive fear. Schools reopened, food distribution stabilized, and medical care reached even the most remote colonies. The Arvini realized that their civilization had not only survived, but was now stronger and more resilient because of the humans' intervention. During this period, the Arvini leadership had the first opportunity to meet with the human commanders. They discovered that the humans, while imposing and powerful, were guided by a clear and simple code: protect the innocent, neutralize the threat, and depart once the mission was complete. There was no desire for conquest, domination, or reward. The Deathworlders acted out of a sense of duty and moral responsibility, their discipline unmatched and their focus unwavering. The Arvini leaders, initially fearful of these beings, now felt immense gratitude. They understood that their civilization, who had survived because these humans had chosen to intervene, decisively and with precision at the most critical moment. Rebuilding efforts continued. Under the careful guidance of the Death, entire colonies were stabilized, critical infrastructure restored, and civilians given the support necessary to resume normal life. The humans did not linger unnecessarily. Once their objectives were met and the immediate threat neutralized, they began preparations to leave. Their departure was as swift and orderly as their arrival. The Arvini watched in awe as the fleet of massive black-armored ships lifted off from the surface, moving with the same deliberate precision that had marked every phase of their intervention. Even after the humans departed, the impact of their actions was deeply felt. That Arvini civilization had survived against overwhelming odds, thanks entirely to the intervention of beings whose skills, judgment, and discipline were beyond imagination. The Krell Dominion, humiliated and defeated, had been forced to retreat from the sector entirely. Communities that had been on the brink of destruction were now stabilized, repaired, and ready to recover. The Arvini began to reflect on what had happened, realizing that the galaxy was far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined, and that survival often depended on unexpected allies with extraordinary capabilities. The sense of relief and gratitude was profound. Citizens, soldiers, and leaders alike knew that their survival had been secured by the humans' intervention. Children who had witnessed the terrifying battle could now experience a sense of safety. Elders who had feared the extinction of their culture could now see a future where their civilization might thrive. And while the Arvini did not fully understand the humans' motivations, they appreciated the sheer effectiveness, precision, and moral discipline displayed in every action. The Deathworlders had arrived, fought, rescued, and departed out without unnecessary destruction, leaving behind a legacy of hope and survival. The resolution of the conflict was not merely a matter of survival. It represented a profound lesson for the Arvini. They learned that true power could be exercised with restraint, that fearsome strength could coexist with moral responsibility, and that even the most desperate situations could be turned around with decisive action. The Deathworlders had demonstrated that the galaxy held forces capable of protecting the weak against overwhelming odds, and that the myths surrounding their existence were not exaggerations. The Arvini now had new understanding, new hope, and new appreciation for the vast and unpredictable universe they inhabited. The Arvini civilization had endured. Thanks to the Deathworlders, the Krell Dominion was defeated, civilians were safe, and the systems that had been on the verge of collapse were stabilized. Reconstruction could now begin in earnest, with the population working to rebuild homes, cities, and lives disrupted by the invasion. The humans had arrived, acted decisively, and left a profound impact on the Arvini society. Their intervention had not only saved lives but also changed the Arvini's understanding of power, responsibility, and the unpredictable nature of the galaxy. The resolution was complete, leaving the Arvini both grateful and awed by the extraordinary beings who had chosen to intervene at the most critical moment. In the days and weeks following the departure of the Deathworlder fleet, the Arvini civilization found itself in a period of profound reflection. The immediate danger posed by the Krell Dominion had been eliminated, their ships either destroyed or forced to retreat far beyond the system, and the surviving colonies were finally safe. Yet the Arvini could not forget the intense fear and uncertainty they had experienced during the days of the Krell assault. the memory of their cities burning, the evacuation of families, and the chaos that had gripped their population lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Every individual, young or old, civilian or soldier, carried the weight of that trauma, and even with safety restored, the realization of how close they had come to annihilation was difficult to process. The Arvini leaders convened a council to address not only the physical reconstruction of their worlds but also the psychological and social recovery of their people. For generations, the Arvini had lived in relative peace, cultivating knowledge, culture, and harmony. The invasion by the Krell and the subsequent intervention of the Deathworlders forced them to confront the fragility of their civilization and the unpredictability of the galaxy at large. Scholars, educators, and religious leaders were called upon to guide the population through this period of reflection. Their goal was not only to rebuild infrastructure but also to instill a sense of resilience, teaching the Arvini how to adapt to a universe where threats could appear without warning and allies could be more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. Even as rebuilding projects began, the Arvini found themselves discussing the nature of the death. Stories that had once been considered myths or exaggerations were now confirmed reality. The humans had arrived in the system with incredible speed, unmatched tactical skill, and technology far beyond anything the Arvini had seen. They had neutralized the Krell threat decisively, rescued countless civilians, and restored stability without unnecessary destruction. Every observer, from military strategists to ordinary citizens, marveled at the precision and restraint of these extraordinary beings. The Deathworlders had not sought recognition or reward. They had acted according to a code of duty and responsibility that the Arvini could only admire. In the colonies that had been hardest hit by the invasion, the effects of the battle lingered most vividly. Many homes had been destroyed or damaged, supply lines disrupted, and public infrastructure ruined. Yet the Arvini found encouragement in the fact that much of the destruction could be repaired, thanks to the intervention of the humans. Emergency shelters, hospitals, and supply depots that had been restored or established by the Deathworlders allowed survivors to rebuild their lives. Children could finally return to schools, families were able to reclaim portions of their homes, and the community began to recover from the trauma of the invasion. Even in areas where damage was extensive, the Arvini recognized that their survival itself was a miracle compared to the total annihilation they had narrowly avoided. The psychological impact of the experience prompted deeper reflection on the nature of their civilization and its place in the galaxy. For centuries, the Arvini had believed in diplomacy, alliances, and the power of negotiation to ensure survival. The Krell invasion had demonstrated the limits of these strategies. Some threats could not be met with discussion or compromise. At the same time, the arrival of the Deathworlders provided a new perspective. Here were beings whose methods were extreme yet precise, whose understanding of danger and protection surpassed anything the Arvini had encountered. The civilization began to appreciate that survival in the galaxy required not only intelligence and foresight but also alliances with forces capable of responding decisively in moments of critical danger. As reconstruction progressed, the Arvini also began to examine their defensive strategies and technology. While the Krell threat had been neutralized, they understood that other dangers could arise at any time. Scientists and engineers studied the methods and tactics employed by the Deathworlders, hoping to learn from them. They analyzed human ship design, battle strategies, and logistical efficiency, though they could not replicate the Deathworlders' capabilities fully. These studies inspired innovations in Arvini technology, new methods of communication, and improved defensive systems. The civilization became more strategic, realizing that survival required both preparation and adaptability. Stories of the battle spread quickly throughout the Arvini population, often shared by those who had witnessed the events firsthand. Families recounted how the humans had intervened at the most critical moments, rescuing children from collapsing structures, disabling Krell ships in mid-flight, and restoring stability to entire colonies. Soldiers spoke of the precision and discipline of the Deathworlders, marveling at their ability to anticipate enemy movements and neutralize threats before they could escalate. Even those who had not directly witnessed the battle understood that their civilization had been saved by extraordinary beings whose presence would leave a lasting mark on Arvini history. These stories became part of the cultural memory, passed down from generation to generation as a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. The Arvini leadership also reflected on the ethical and philosophical implications of what had occurred. The Deathworlders had demonstrated that great power could be exercised with restraint, that intervention could be decisive yet merciful, and that protecting life required both courage and discipline. The Arvini had traditionally valued harmony and nonviolence, but now they saw that in a universe filled with danger, strength and decisiveness were sometimes necessary to preserve that harmony. The civilization began to integrate these lessons into its governance, education, and military training, emphasizing the importance of adaptability, responsibility, and ethical action in a complex and unpredictable galaxy. At the same time, there was a sense of humility among the Arvini. They recognized that their survival had not been the result of their own strength alone. but of the intervention of a species that operated on an entirely different level. This realization brought a mix of gratitude and reflection. While they had contributed to the defense of their colonies and the rescue of civilians, the decisive factor in their survival had been the humans' arrival. The Arvini understood that the galaxy was vast and unpredictable, and that alliances with extraordinary beings could determine the fate of civilizations. They were grateful for the Deathworlder's actions, but they also acknowledged that they could not rely solely on others for future protection. Communities began to rebuild in earnest. Cities were reconstructed using a combination of traditional Arvini architecture and innovative techniques inspired by the humans' efficiency. Infrastructure, including transportation networks, energy grids, and communication systems, was upgraded and reinforced. Emergency protocols were revised to incorporate lessons learned from the invasion, ensuring that civilians could respond more effectively to future threats. The Arvini also prioritized education, teaching children and adults alike about the importance of resilience, preparation, and adaptability. The experience of near destruction had left an enduring impression, motivating the civilization to strengthen its society in every possible way. Cultural and social reflection continued alongside physical reconstruction. Artists, writers, and philosophers explored the meaning of the invasion and the intervention of the Deathworlders. Paintings, stories, and songs celebrated the courage and skill of the humans, while also exploring themes of vulnerability, resilience, and the nature of power. Scholars debated the ethical lessons of the events, examining how strength could coexist with morality, how intervention could be both destructive and protective, and how civilizations could survive in a universe filled with unpredictable dangers. These discussions shaped the intellectual and cultural evolution of the Arvini, creating a deeper understanding of their place in the galaxy. The Arvini also began to assess their relationships with other civilizations. They realized that their reliance on the Unity Coalition, while valuable, was not sufficient in itself. They needed to build broader alliances and maintain awareness of extraordinary forces such as the Deathworlders. Diplomatic missions were initiated, not only to strengthen existing alliances but also to explore potential partnerships with other species capable of providing support in critical situations. The Arvini recognized that survival in the galaxy depended on both their own resilience and their ability to collaborate with beings of the exceptional skill and power. The memory of the Krell Dominion's attack also prompted reflection on the fragility of peace. For centuries, the Arvini had believed that their isolated location, peaceful nature, and diplomacy would shield them from large-scale threats. The invasion shattered that illusion, demonstrating that even the most careful planning and negotiation could not guarantee safety. At the same time, the intervention of the Deathworlders revealed that hope could emerge in unexpected forms. The civilization learned to balance caution with openness to extraordinary opportunities, understanding that survival required both vigilance and trust in forces beyond their immediate comprehension. As months passed, life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. Schools reopened fully, trade resumed, and communities celebrated small victories in rebuilding homes and restoring infrastructure. Yet beneath the surface, the Arvini carried a permanent awareness of the galaxy's dangers and the role that extraordinary allies could play in ensuring survival. The story of the Deathworlders' intervention became central to their collective identity, a symbol of hope, courage, and the profound impact that decisive action could have on the fate of an entire civilization. Generations later, the events of the Krell invasion and the Deathworlder intervention were remembered, not just as historical facts but as defining moments in Arvini culture. Children grew up hearing about the courage, skill, and moral discipline of the humans who had saved them. Leaders reflected on the importance of preparedness, adaptability, and strategic alliances. Scholars studied the events to understand both the nature of galactic threats and the methods by which survival could be ensured. The Arvini civilization, once focused solely on harmony and peace, now possessed a deeper understanding of the complexities of the galaxy, the potential for both danger and salvation, and the importance of extraordinary allies in critical moments. In private reflection, many Arvini considered the philosophical lessons of what had occurred. The Deathworlders had acted decisively, efficiently, and morally, demonstrating that true power could be combined with responsibility. The Arvini had witnessed a force capable of extraordinary destruction, yet one that used that power to protect life rather than to dominate or conquer. These lessons influenced not only military strategy but also governance, diplomacy, and societal values. The civilization understood that courage, precision, and moral clarity could change the course of history, and that even in moments of greatest danger, hope could manifest in unexpected, transformative ways. The legacy of the events extended beyond immediate recovery. The Arvini adopted new technologies inspired by the humans' interventions, improved emergency response systems, and strengthened their societal cohesion. Communities were more resilient, citizens were more informed, and leadership was better prepared for crises. The memory of near destruction and miraculous salvation became a guiding force in shaping policies, education, and culture. While the threat of the galaxy remained, the Arvini now faced it with a greater sense of preparedness, understanding, an appreciation for the forces that could protect and inspire them in the end. That Arvini civilization emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The Krell Dominion had been defeated, the Deathworlders had departed, and the population could finally begin to heal fully. The events left an indelible mark on their history, shaping not only their understanding of survival but also their perception of power, morality, and the galaxy itself. They learned that danger could come swiftly and without warning, but that extraordinary intervention, discipline, and courage could turn despair into hope. The reflection on these events would guide Arvini society for generations, ensuring that the lessons of the past would inform their future and that the memory of the Deathworlders' intervention would remain a symbol of salvation, courage, and the enduring possibility of survival in a vast and unpredictable universe. Asterisk,